Squad. You know what time it is. It's the view over there. It's not bad. It's a bit flat though. But who gives a damn? Alright. I'm gonna go ahead and start on the second chapter, maybe even the third, of how we got to now, right? So last time we talked about glass, yes. You guys can watch that if you. This book has a lot of pictures. I'm gonna have to use the phone a lot to show you guys the pictures. I need a better place, maybe? Hold on. Yeah, look at my pink dots. That'll be fun. Yeah, focus on my sweater, will you? Okay. That's not a really good picture. There we go. I think that's better. Okay. Chapter 2, Cold. In the early summer months of 1834, a three-masted bark vessel named the Madagascar sailed into the port of Rio de Janeiro, its hull filled with the most implausible of cargo, a frozen New England lake. The Madagascar and her crew were in the service of an enterprising and dogged Boston businessman named Frederick Tudor. History now knows him as the Ice King, but for most of his early adulthood he was an abject failure, albeit one with remarkable tenacity. He's just like me for real. Ice is an interesting subject for contemplation, Thoreau wrote in Walden, gazing out at the beautifully blue frozen expanse of his Massachusetts pond. Tudor had grown up contemplating the same scenery. As a well-to-do young Bostonian, his family had long enjoyed the frozen water from the pond on their country estate, Rockwood, not just for its aesthetics, but also for its enduring capacity to make things cold. Like many wealthy families in northern climes, is that an actual word? Climes. Dang. It's just climate. Why does climb exist when climate works well? The hell? English is a fucked up thing, dude. Anyways. Like many wealthy families in northern climes, the Tudors stored blocks of frozen ice water in ice houses, 200-pound ice cubes that would remain marvelously unmelted until the hot summer months arrived, and then a new ritual began, chipping off slices from the blocks to freshen drinks, make ice cream, cool down a bath during a heat wave. Chipping off slices, interesting. And it's from a lake. Well, of course, it's the past. It's the fucking 19th century, dude. Sanitation was not really important back then. But still, I would be concerned at best about the sanitation of this lake. The idea of a block of ice surviving intact for months without the benefit of artificial The idea of a block of ice surviving intact for months without the benefit of artificial refrigeration sounds unlikely to the modern ear. We are used to ice preserved indefinitely thanks to the many deep freeze technologies of today's world, but ice in the wild is another matter. Other than the occasional glacier, we assume that a block of ice can't survive longer than an hour in summer heat, much less months. But Tudor knew from personal experience that a large block of ice could last well into the depths of summer if it was kept out of the sun, or at least it would last through to the late spring of New England. And that knowledge would plant the seed of an idea in his mind, an idea that would ultimately cost him his sanity, his fortune, and his freedom, before it made him an immensely wealthy man. I just want to show you guys this picture of the man himself, the Tudor, Frederick Tudor. I remember Tudor was a family in like the War of the Roses, right? Tudors versus the Lancasters. Hold on, I think I'm misremembering. I'm gonna search it up. Oh, House of York. Fuck. Oh, culminating in the rise of the Tudor dynasty. That's why I remember it, because it was the like the agreement, the joining of the two houses. That was the Tudors. Yeah. Okay. You know, whenever I remember things, I'm like 90% there. I'm never really that accurate, but I'm 90% there. At the age of 17, Tudor's father sent him on a voyage to the Caribbean, accompanying his older brother John, who suffered from a knee ailment that had effectively rendered him an invalid. The idea was the warm climates would improve John's health, but in fact they had the opposite effect. Arriving in Havana, the Tudor brothers were quickly overwhelmed by the muggy weather. They soon sailed north back to the mainland, stopping in Savannah and Charleston, but the early summer heat followed them, and John fell ill with what may have been tuberculosis. 6 months later, he was dead at the age of 20. As a medical intervention, the Tudor brothers' Caribbean adventure was a complete disaster, but suffering through the inescapable humidity of the tropics in the full regalia of the 19th century gentleman suggested a radical, some would say preposterous, idea to young Frederick Tudor. If he could somehow transport ice from the frozen north to the West Indies, there would be an immense market for it. The history of global trade had clearly demonstrated that vast fortunes could be made by transporting a commodity that was ubiquitous in one environment to a place where it was scarce. To the young Tudor, ice seemed to fit the equation perfectly. Nearly worthless in Boston, ice would be priceless in Havana. The ice trade was nothing more than a hunch, but for some reason Tudor kept it alive in his mind through the grieving after his brother's demise, through the aimless years of a young man of means in Boston society. Sometime during this period, 2 years after his brother's death, he shared his implausible scheme with his brother William and his future brother-in-law, the even wealthier Robert Gardiner. A few months after his sister's wedding, Tudor began taking notes in a journal. As a frontispiece, he drew a sketch of the Rockwood building that had long enabled his family to escape the warmth of the summer sun. He called it the Ice House Diary. The first entry read, "Plan, etc. for transporting ice to tropical climates. Boston, August 1st, 1805. William and myself have this day determined to get together what property we have and embark on the undertaking of carrying ice to the West Indies the ensuing winter." The entry was typical of Tudor's whole demeanor, brisk, confident, almost comically ambitious. Brother William was apparently less convinced of the scheme's promise. Tudor's confidence in the scheme derived from the ultimate value of the ice once it made its way to the tropics. In a country where at some seasons of the year the heat is almost unsupportable, he wrote in a subsequent entry, where at times the common necessity of life, water, cannot be had but in a tepid state, ice must be considered as outdoing most other luxuries. The ice trade was destined to endow the Tudor brothers with fortunes larger than we shall know what to do with. He seems to have given less thought to the challenges of transporting the ice. In correspondence from the period, Tudor relays third-hand stories, almost certainly apocryphal, of ice cream being shipped intact from England to Trinidad as prima facie evidence that his plan would work. Reading the Ice House Diary now, you can hear the voice of a young man in the full fever of conviction, closing the cognitive blinds against doubt and counter-argument. Man, he got his brother in on the plan, even though his brother is just not convinced. Interesting. You know, the brother's got a whole life with him as well. And he's going with Frederick on what he believes to be absolutely dog shit of a plan. I don't know, that just seems kind of comical. It's like a sidekick in a movie. I don't know. What else? Let's keep going. However deluded Frederick might have seemed, he had one thing in his favor. He had the means to put the broad strokes of his plan in motion. He had enough money to hire a ship and an endless supply of ice, manufactured by Mother Nature each winter. And so, in November 1805, Tudor dispatched his brother and cousin off to Martinique as an advance guard, with instructions to negotiate exclusive rights to the ice that would follow several months later. When waiting for word from his envoys, Tudor bought a brig called the Favorite for $4,750 and began harvesting ice in preparation for the journey. In February, Tudor set sail from Boston Harbor, the Favorite loaded with a full cargo of rockwood ice bound for the West Indies. Tudor's scheme was bold enough to attract the attention of the press, though the tone left something to be desired. No joke, the Boston Gazette reported, a vessel with a cargo of 80 tons of ice has cleared out from this port for Martinique. We hope this will not prove to be a slippery speculation. The Gazette's derision would turn out to be well-founded, though not for the reasons one might expect. Despite a number of weather-related delays, the ice survived the journey in remarkably good shape. The problem proved to be one that Tudor had never contemplated. The residents of Martinique had no interest in his exotic frozen bounty. They simply had no idea what to do with it. We take it for granted in the modern world that an ordinary day will involve exposure to a wide range of temperatures. We enjoy piping hot coffee in the morning and ice cream for dessert at the end of the day. At the end of the day, those of us who live in climates with hot summers expect to bounce back and forth between AC offices and brutal humidity. Hold on. Brilliantly, huh? It's the toothpaste. Where winter rules, we bundle up and venture out into the frigid streets, and then turn up the thermostat when we return home. But the overwhelming majority of humans living in equatorial climes in 1800 would have literally never once experienced anything cold. The idea of frozen water would have been as fanciful to the residents of Martinique as an iPhone. The mysterious, almost magical properties of ice would eventually appear in one of the great opening lines of 20th century literature, in Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. Many years later, as he faced the firing squad, Colonel Aureliano Buendia was to remember that distant afternoon when his father took him to discover ice. Buendia recalls a series of fairs put on by roving gypsies during his childhood, each showcasing some extraordinarily new technology. The gypsies display magnetic ingots, telescopes, and microscopes, but none of these engineering achievements impressed the residents of the imaginary South American town of Macondo as much as a simple block of ice. But sometimes the sheer novelty of an object can make its utility hard to discern. This was Tudor's first mistake. He assumed the absolute novelty of ice would be a point in his favor. He figured his blocks of ice would outdo all the other luxuries. Instead, they just received blank stares. It smells like a fish and tastes like toothpaste. What the fuck is this? The indifference to ice's magical powers had prevented Tudor's brother William from lining up an exclusive buyer for the cargo. Even worse, William had failed to establish a suitable location to store the ice. Tudor had made it all the way to Martinique, but found himself with no demand for a project that was melting in the tropical heat at an alarming rate. He posted handbills around town that included specific instructions on how to carry and preserve the ice, but found few takers. He did manage to make some ice cream, thereby impressing a few locals who believed the delicacy couldn't be created so close to the equator. But the trip was ultimately a complete failure. In his diary, he estimated that he had lost nearly $4,000 with his tropical misadventure. The bleak pattern of the Martinique voyage would repeat itself in the years to come, with ever more catastrophic results. Tudor sent a series of ice ships to the Caribbean, with only a modest increase in demand for his product. In the meantime, his family fortunes collapsed, and the Tudors retreated to the Rockwood farm, which, like most New England land, had very poor agricultural prospects. Harvesting the ice was the family's last best hope, but it was a hope that most of Boston openly ridiculed, and a series of shipwrecks and embargoes made that ridicule seem increasingly appropriate. In 1813, Tudor was thrown in debtor's prison. He penned the following entry in his diary several days later. On Monday the 9th instant, I was arrested and locked up as a debtor in Boston jail. On this memorable day in my little annals, I am 28 years, 6 months, and 5 days old. It is an event which I think I could not have avoided, but it is a climax which I did hope to have escaped, as my affairs are looking well at last, after a fearful struggle with adverse circumstances for 7 years. But it has taken place, and I have endeavored to meet it as I would the tempest of heaven, which should serve to strengthen rather than reduce the spirit of a true man. Of a true man. I should face my problems like a true man. Honestly, though, it must be a really significant event if he's listing his age down to the day. What the hell? Tudor's fledgling business suffered from two primary liabilities. He had a demand problem, in that most of his potential customers didn't understand why his product might be useful, and he had a storage problem. He was losing too much of his product in the heat, particularly once it arrived in the tropics. But his New England base gave him one crucial advantage beyond the ice itself. Unlike the U.S. South, with its sugar plantations and cotton fields, the northeastern states were largely divided. Oh, good. That is the way. See, you wouldn't see my dick, dude. There we go. Unlike the U.S. South, with its sugar plantations and cotton fields, the northeastern states were largely devoid of natural resources that could be sold elsewhere. This meant that ships tended to leave Boston Harbor empty, heading off for the West Indies to fill their holds with valuable cargo before returning to the wealthy markets of the eastern seaboard. Paying a crew to sail a ship with no cargo was effectively burning money. Any cargo was better than nothing, which meant that Tudor could negotiate cheaper rates for himself by loading his ice onto what would have otherwise been an empty ship, and thereby avoiding the need to buy and maintain his own vessels. I see, so they're going off to the Caribbean, getting some stuff there, coming back to sell, but they have to go back to the Caribbean to get more stuff. So they're coming back to the Caribbean empty, and that's a waste. So he's putting ice on those ships, which would be a win-win for everyone, you know? Isn't that cool? I wish I was that clever. Part of the beauty of ice, of course, was that it was basically free. Tudor only needed to pay workers to carve blocks of it out of the frozen lakes. New England's economy generated another product that was equally worthless: sawdust, the primary waste product of lumber mills. After years of experimenting with different solutions, Tudor discovered that sawdust made a brilliant insulator for his ice. Blocks layered on top of each other with the sawdust separating them would last almost twice as long as unprotected ice. This was Tudor's frugal genius. He took three things that the market had effectively priced at zero: ice, sawdust, and an empty vessel, and turned them into a flourishing business. Tudor's initial catastrophic trip to Martinique had made it clear that he needed on-site storage in the tropics that he could control. It was too dangerous to keep his rapidly melting product in buildings that weren't specifically engineered to insulate ice from the summer heat. He tinkered with multiple icehouse designs, finally settling on a double-shelled structure that used the air between two stone walls to keep the interior cool. Tudor didn't understand the molecular chemistry of it, but both the sawdust and the double-shelled architecture revolved around the same principle. For ice to melt, it needs to pull heat from the surrounding environment to break the tetrahedral bonding of hydrogen atoms that gives ice its crystalline structure. The extraction of heat from the surrounding atmosphere is what grants ice its miraculous capacity to cool us down. The only place where that heat exchange can happen is at the surface of the ice, which is why large blocks of ice survive for so long. All the interior hydrogen bonds are perfectly insulated from the exterior temperature. If you try to protect ice from external warmth with some kind of substance that conducts heat efficiently, metal for instance, the hydrogen bonds will break down quickly into water. But if you create a buffer between, fuck you. What the fuck was that, man? But if you create a buffer between the external heat and the ice that conducts heat poorly, the ice will preserve its crystalline state for much longer. As a thermal conductor, ice is about 22 times less efficient than metal, and then more than 20 times less efficient than glass. In his ice houses, Tudor's double-shelled structure created a buffer of air that kept the summer heat away from the ice. His sawdust packaging on the ships ensured that there were countless pockets of air between the wood shavings to keep the ice insulated. Modern insulators such as styrofoam rely on the same technique. The coolers you take on a picnic keeps your watermelon chilled because it is made of polystyrene chains interspersed with tiny pockets of gas. My reading ability is fucked today. I feel like a restarted person. By 1815, Tudor had finally assembled the key pieces of the ice puzzle: harvesting, insulation, and transport and storage. Still pursued by his creditors, he began making regular shipments to a state-of-the-art ice house he had built in Havana, where an appetite for ice cream had been slowly maturing. 15 years after his original hunch, Tudor's ice trade had finally turned a profit. By the 1820s, he had ice houses packed with frozen New England water all over the American South. By the 1830s, his ships were sailing to Rio and Bombay. India would ultimately prove to be his most lucrative market. By his death in 1864, Tudor had amassed a fortune worth more than $200 million in today's money. 3 decades after his first failed voyage, Tudor wrote these lines in his journal. This day I sailed from Boston 30 years ago in the brig Favorite Captain Pearson from Martinique with the first cargo of ice. Last year I shipped upwards of 30 cargoes of ice, and as much as 40 more were shipped by other persons. The business is established. It cannot be given up now and does not depend upon a single life. Mankind will have the blessing forever, whether I die soon or live long. Tudor's triumphant, if long-delayed success selling ice around the world seems implausible to us today, not just because it's hard to imagine blocks of ice surviving the passage from Boston to Bombay. There is an additional, almost philosophical curiosity to the ice business. Most of the trade in natural goods involves material that thrives in high-energy environments. Sugarcane, coffee, tea, cotton, all these staples of 18th and 19th century commerce were dependent on the blistering heat of tropical and subtropical climates. The fossil fuels that now circle the planet in tankers and pipelines are simply solar energy that was captured and stored by plants millions of years ago. You could make a fortune in 1800 by taking things that only grew in high-energy environments and shipping them off into low-energy climates. But the ice trade, arguably for the only time in the history of global commerce, reversed that pattern. What made ice valuable was precisely the low-energy state of a New England winter, and the peculiar capacity of ice to store that lack of energy for long periods of time. The cash crops of the tropics caused populations to swell in climates that could be unforgivingly hot, which in turn, unforgivingly hot, which in turn created a market for a product that allowed you to escape the heat. In the long history of human commerce, energy had always correlated with value. In the more heat, the more solar energy, the more you could grow. But in a world which was tilting towards the productive heat of sugarcane and cotton plantations, cold could be an asset as well. That was Tudor's great insight. In the winter of 1846, Henry Thoreau, watched ice cutters employed by Frederick Tudor carve blocks out of Walden Pond with a horse-drawn plow. It might have been a scene out of Bruegel, men working in a wintry landscape with simple tools, far from the industrial age that thundered elsewhere. But Thoreau knew their labor was attached to a wider network. In his diaries, he wrote a lilting reverie on the global reach of the ice trade. Thus, it appears that the sweltering inhabitants of Charleston and New Orleans, of Madras and Bombay and Calcutta, drink at my well. The pure Walden water is mingled with the sacred water of the Ganges. With favoring winds, it is wafted past the site of the fabulous islands of Atlantis and the Hesperides. Makes the periplus of Hanno, and floating by Ternate and Tidor, and the mouth of the Persian Gulf, melts in the tropic gales of the Indian seas, and is landed in ports of which Alexander only heard the names. Fucking, in some ways, I absolutely adore the fanciful language of 19th century writers, but at the same time, it must hurt like hell to speak like that, dude. What the hell? If anything, Thoreau was underestimating the scope of that global network, because the ice trade that Tudor created was about much more than frozen water. The blank stares that had confronted Tudor's first shipment of ice to Martinique slowly but steadily gave way to an ever-widening dependence on ice. Ice-chilled drinks became a staple of life in southern states. Even today, Americans are far more likely to enjoy ice with their beverages than Europeans, a distinct legacy of Tudor's ambition. By 1850, Tudor's success had inspired countless imitators, and more than 100,000 tons of Boston ice were shipped around the world in a single year. By 1860, 2 out of 3 New York homes had daily deliveries of ice. One contemporary account describes how tightly bound ice had become to the rituals of daily life. In workshops, composing rooms, counting houses, workmen, printers, clerks club to have In workshops, composing rooms, counting houses, workmen, printers, clerks clubbed to have their daily supply of ice. Every office, nook or cranny, illuminated by a human face, is also cooled by the presence of his crystal friend. It is as good as oil to the wheel. It sets the whole human machinery on pleasant action, turns the wheels of commerce, and propels the energetic business engine. That is a wonderful quote, dude. Like, literally. Every office, nook, or cranny illuminated by a human face. That's, my God. That's wonderful. It's also cooled, illuminated, cooled, heat, cool, oh my goodness, by the presence of his crystal friend. It is as good as oil to the wheel. Isn't that cool? Like, wheel rotates, there's friction causes heat, right? And so oil prevents the heat from building up, and same way that ice prevents the climate heat from building up and making people less productive, right? A wheel needs lubrication to be productive for long periods of time. A human needs homeostasis, good temperature regulation to also be productive. Isn't that, oh my goodness gracious, there are so many parallels in that quote. Oh my God. Sorry. The dependence on natural ice became so severe that every decade or so, an unusually warm winter would send the newspapers into a frenzy with speculation about an ice famine. As late as 1906, the New York Times was running alarming headlines: ice up to 40 cents and a famine in sight. The paper went on to provide some historical context. Not in 16 years has New York faced such an iceless prospect as this year. In 1890, there was a great deal of trouble, and the whole country had to be scoured for ice. Since then, however, the needs for ice have grown vastly. And the famine is a much more serious matter now than it was then. In less than a century, ice had gone from a curiosity to a luxury to a necessity. Ice-powered refrigeration changed the map of America, nowhere more so than in the transformation of Chicago. Chicago's initial burst of growth had come after the nexus of canals and rail lines connected the city to both the Gulf of Mexico and the cities of the eastern seaboard. Its fortuitous location as a transportation hub, created both by nature and some of the most ambitious engineering of the century, enabled wheat to flow from the bountiful plains to the northeastern population centers. But meat couldn't make the journey without spoiling. Chicago developed a large trade in preserved pork starting in the middle of the century, with the first stockyards slaughtering the hogs on the outskirts of the city before sending the goods east in barrels. But fresh beef remained largely a local delicacy. In fresh barrels. Oh, not in fresh barrels, just in barrels. Imagine selling meat in barrels, though. What the hell? Anyways, here's an image of people working on ice. Isn't that cool? I see they've got pickaxe embedded in there, I think, right? And they've got like this rope. They got a pulley system, right? They got a pulley system. Oh, isn't that great? Wonders of engineering. By the way, they're harvesting all this ice from Boston, right? And like, I know, like lakes contain a lot of water, but with this industry being so freaking prosperous, wouldn't it make sense for like the ice to eventually like run out? That's from the story, just not mentioning that. I'm just assuming they just didn't run out. At the same time, it's kind of ludicrous that they didn't run out. Like, ice is becoming a necessity for everyone in America, and yet we're not running out. And soon they're going to talk about like ice being used to preserve food, for air conditioning, and they still don't run out of ice in those lakes in Boston. My God. Also, like, the more they take ice, you know, like ice, lakes freeze from the top down, right? If they run out of ice in a lake, like eventually, like the things in the lake, like fishes and stuff, they're gonna get trapped in the ice, right? So like, you get a shipment of ice, you look in there, you see this fish just frozen in the ice block, right? And you're like, oh good, a little treat of protein alongside my ice. Isn't that cool? Although, we probably shouldn't put the ice in drinks though, right? Because, you know, it's gonna be fish flavored, and it might contain disease because it's, you know, raw fish, you know? Anyways, I don't know, I'm just having a ton of questions, man. But as the century progressed, a supply-demand imbalance developed between the hungry cities of the Northeast and the cattle of the Midwest. As immigration fueled the population of New York and Philadelphia and other urban centers in the 1840s and 50s, the supply of local beef failed to keep up with the surging demand in the growing cities. Meanwhile, the conquest of the Great Plains had enabled ranchers to breed massive herds of cattle, without a corresponding population base of humans to feed. You could ship live cattle by train to the eastern states to be slaughtered locally, but transporting entire cows was expensive, and the animals were often malnourished or even injured en route. Almost half would be inedible, by the time they arrived in New York or in Boston. It was ice that ultimately provided a way around this impasse. In 1868, the pork magnate Benjamin Hutchinson built a new packing plant featuring cooling rooms packed with natural ice that allowed them to pack pork year-round, one of the principal innovations of the industry. According to Donald Miller in his History of the 19th Century Chicago, City of the Century. Oh. I fucked that sentence up. Give me a second. In 1868, the pork magnate Benjamin Hutchinson built a new packing plant featuring cooling rooms packed with natural ice that allowed them to pack pork year-round, one of the principal innovations in the industry, according to Donald Miller in his History of the 19th Century Chicago, City of the Century. It was the beginning of a revolution that would transform not only Chicago but the entire natural landscape of Middle America. In the years after the fire of 1871, Hutchinson's cooling rooms would inspire other entrepreneurs to integrate ice-cooled facilities to the meat packing trade. A few began transporting beef back east in open-air rail cars during winter, relying on the ambient temperature to keep the steaks cold. In 1878, Gustavus Franklin Swift hired an engineer to build an advanced rail refrigerator car designed from the ground up to transport beef to the eastern seaboard year-round. Ice was placed in bins above the meat. At stops along the route, workers could swap in new blocks from above without disturbing the meat below. It was this application of elementary physics, Miller writes, that transformed the ancient trade of beef slaughtering from a local to an international business, for refrigerator cars led naturally to refrigerator ships, which carried Chicago beef to 4 continents. His success in that global trade transformed the natural landscape of the American plains in ways that are still visible today. The vast shimmering grasslands were plated by industrial feedlots, creating, in Miller's words, a city-country food system that was the most powerful environmental force in transforming the American landscape since the Ice Age glaciers began their final retreat. Interesting. It is cool though, right? The first time in human history that ice is like conquering the Caribbean and the countryside and all this and that is due to refrigeration, right? Back then it was all natural processes like snowball earth and like glaciers and ice ages. Isn't that cool? And yet, like back in the last chapter in Glass, the first artificial enhancement to our human bodies was lenses, right? Yeah, like there's a recurring theme of like first thing being done artificially, whether it's glass or like ice or whatever, dude. Isn't that cool? Isn't that fucking cool? Oh, and there's similarities between glass and ice as well. They're both clear. That's about it. Oh my god. Oh yeah, there's a picture here. People cutting ice in Harlem. In Harlem? Interesting. I guess even New York summers can be brutal. Oh yeah, it's a brutal summer today, this year, yeah. The Chicago stockyards that emerged in the last 2 decades of the 19th century were, as Upton Sinclair wrote, the greatest aggregation of labor and capital ever gathered in one place. 14 million animals were slaughtered in an average year. In many ways, the industrial food complex held in such disdain by modern-day slow food advocates begins with the Chicago stockyards and the web of ice-cooled transport that extended out from these grim feedlots and slaughterhouses. Progressives like Upton Sinclair painted Chicago as a kind of Dante's Inferno of industrialization, but in reality, most of the technology employed in the stockyards would have been recognizable to a medieval butcher. That's profound. The most advanced form of technology in the whole chain was the refrigerated rail car. Theodore Dreiser got it right when he described the stockyard assembly line as a direct sloping path to death, dissection, and the refrigerator. The conventional story about Chicago is that it was made possible thanks to the invention of the railroad and the building of the Erie Canal. But those accounts tell only part of the story. The runaway growth of Chicago would never have been possible without the peculiar chemical properties of water, its capacity for storing and slowly releasing cold with only the slightest of human interventions. If the chemical properties of liquid water had somehow turned out to be different, life on Earth would have taken a radically different shape, or more likely would not have evolved at all. But if water hadn't also possessed its peculiar aptitude for freezing, the trajectory of 19th century America would have almost certainly been different as well. You could send spices around the globe without the advantages of refrigeration, but you couldn't send beef. Ice made a new kind of food network imaginable. We think of Chicago as a city of broad shoulders, of railroad empires and slaughterhouses, but it is just as true to say it was built on the tetrahedral bonds of hydrogen. Interesting. They talked about ships coming from Chicago, and I was like, what the fuck? Chicago's in, like, Illinois, right? Or Indiana. Illinois, Indiana. Who cares? They're the same. But, like, I was like, that's so far from the coast, right? How can they ship stuff anywhere? And then I realized, oh, there's the Great Lakes. Right. That makes sense. And then they talked about the Erie Canal. They mentioned it. And I was like, okay. So they go through the Great Lakes, probably exit through Canada, I think. I forget. Still, though, traveling that long to get to the coast, I would never have imagined Chicago to be involved in, like, maritime transport and trade. That's fucking weird as hell. If you widen your frame of reference and look at the ice trade in the context of technological history, there's something puzzling, almost anachronistic about Tudor's invention. This was the middle of the 19th century, after all, an era of coal-powered factories, with railroads and telegraph wires connecting massive cities, and yet the state-of-the-art in coal technology was still entirely based on cutting chunks of frozen water out of a lake. Humans had been experimenting with the technology of heat for at least 100,000 years, since the mastery of fire, arguably Homo sapiens' first innovation. But the opposite end of the thermal spectrum was much more challenging. A century into the Industrial Revolution, artificial cold was still a fantasy. That's interesting. That's very interesting. No wonder there's an, what's the Telemachus? No, not Telemachus. I'm rambling, but there was this giant in Greek mythology that gave humans the power to make fire, and I was just commenting on the fact there isn't a parallel for cold. It's always like fire being technology, right? And yet ice is not technology. Even though we have refrigeration and we have air conditioning, being able to make things colder was never seen as a technological thing for us humans as much as making things hot was, right? And cold is as much used in the process of in making and preparing meat as much as heat is, right? When you have to preserve meat, you make it cold. When you have to prepare meat for consumption, you make it hot. That's, what a parallel. Oh my god. I'm actually going crazy. Holy shit. But the commercial demand for ice, all those millions of dollars flowing upstream from the tropics to the ice barrens of New England, sent a signal out across the world that there was money to be made from cold, which inevitably sent some inventive minds off in search of the next logical step of artificial cold. You might assume Tudor's success would inspire a new generation of equally mercenary entrepreneur inventors to create a revolution in man-made refrigeration. Yet, however much we may celebrate the startup culture of today's tech world, essential innovations don't always come out of private sector exploration. New ideas are not always motivated, like Tudor's, by dreams of fortunes larger than we shall know what to do with. The art of human invention has more than one muse. While the ice trade began with a young man's dream of untold riches, the story of artificial cold began with a more urgent and humanitarian need, a doctor trying to keep his patients alive. Give me a second, I gotta get water. My ability to talk today is kinda hampered. I don't know why, but I gotta drink some water. My throat is feeling kind of weird again. Not as a sickness thing, but more like a talking for 45 straight minutes type of thing. It's a story that begins at the scale of insects in Apalachicola, Apalachicola, Florida, a town of 10,000 people living alongside a swamp in a subtropical climate. The perfect... Oh, sorry. It's a story that begins at the scale of insects. In Apalachicola, Florida, a town of 10,000 people living alongside a swamp in a subtropical climate. The perfect environment for breeding mosquitoes. In 1842, abundant mosquitoes meant, inevitably, the risk of malaria. At the modest local hospital, a doctor named John Gorey, thought there was a spider web on my desk, sorry. A doctor named John Gorey sat helpless as dozens of his patients burned up with fever. Desperate for a way to reduce his patients' fevers, Gorey tried suspending blocks of ice from the hospital ceiling. It turned out to be an effective solution. The ice blocks cooled the air cooled the patients. With fevers reduced, some of his patients survived their illnesses, but Gorey's clever hack, designed to combat the dangerous effects of subtropical climates, was ultimately undermined by another byproduct of the environment. The tropical humidity that made Florida such a hospitable climate for mosquitoes also helped breed another threat: hurricanes. A string of shipwrecks delayed ice shipments from Tudor's New England, which left Gorey without his usual supply. And so the young doctor began mulling over a more radical solution for his hospital, making his own ice. Luckily for Gorey, it happened to be the perfect time to have this idea. For thousands of years, the idea of making artificial cold had been almost unthinkable to human civilization. We invented agriculture and cities and aqueducts and the printing press, but cold was outside the boundaries of possibility for all these years. And yet somehow artificial cold became imaginable in the middle of the 19th century. To use the wonderful phrase of the complexity theorist Stuart Kauffman, cold became part of the adjacent possible of the period. We're making a parallel between people finally thinking about artificial cold when in this time, and people finally thinking of how farsighted they were when they first began to read, right? Like, isn't it that technology and industry and innovation not only creates new materials, new ways of living, but also new ways of thinking, right? It's much more than the fact that we figured out how to make lenses. We can read now, right? We can look at telescopes, we can look at the sky, we can look at the stars, we can look at cells, we can do all this and that. It's much more than that. I'm finally thinking about the way I see, right? I'm finally thinking about how farsighted I am. Isn't that, oh my god. No, wait. I don't know. What else? Anyways, here's a portrait of John Gorey. He's painted like an American president. He's painted like George Washington with that red curtain and that desk full of stuff. How do we explain this breakthrough? It's not just a matter of a solitary genius coming up with a brilliant invention because he or she is smarter than everyone else, and that's because ideas are fundamentally networks of other ideas. We take the tools and metaphors and concepts and scientific understanding of our time and we remix them into something new. But if you don't have the right building blocks, you can't make the breakthrough, however brilliant you might be. The smartest mind in the world couldn't invent a refrigerator in the middle of the 17th century. It simply wasn't part of the adjacent possible at that moment. But by 1850, the pieces had come together. The first thing that had to happen seems almost comical to us today. We had to discover that air was actually made of something, that it wasn't just empty space between objects. In the 1600s, amateur scientists discovered a bizarre phenomenon: the vacuum, air that seemed actually to be composed of nothing, and that behaved differently from normal air. Yo. Hello?
it.
I can record it. In the 1600s, amateur scientists discovered a bizarre phenomenon. The vacuum, air that seemed actually to be composed of nothing and that behaved differently from normal air. Flames would be extinguished in the vacuum. A vacuum seal was so strong that 2 teams of horses could not pull it apart. In 1659, the English scientist Robert Boyle had placed a bird in a jar and sucked the air out with a vacuum pump. The bird died, as Boyle suspected it might, but curiously enough, it also froze. If a vacuum was so different from normal air that it could extinguish life, that meant there must be some invisible substance that normal air was made of, and it suggested that changing the volume and pressure of gases could change the temperature. Our knowledge expanded in the 18th century as the steam engine forced engineers to figure out exactly how heat and energy are converted, inventing a whole science of thermodynamics. Tools for measuring heat and weight with increased precision were developed, along with standardized scales such as Celsius and Fahrenheit. As is so often the case in the history of science and innovation, when you have a leap forward in the accuracy of measuring something, new possibilities emerge. All of those building blocks were circulating through Gorey's mind like molecules in a gas, bouncing off each other, forming new connections. In his spare time, he started to build a refrigeration machine. It would use energy from a pump to compress air. The compression heated the air. The machine then cooled down the compressed air by running it through pipes cooled with water. When the air expanded, it pulled heat from its environment, and just like the tetrahedral bonds of hydrogen dissolving into liquid water, the heat extraction cooled the surrounding air. It could even be used to create ice. Hold on. It would use energy from a pump to compress air. The compression heated the air. The machine then cooled down the compressed air by running it through pipes cooled with water. When the air expanded, it pulled heat from its environment. What? So expanding air cools, as it pulls heat in. Does that mean when we're blowing up a balloon, we're actually making the air colder? Like the air outside the balloon, since it's pulling heat in? Are we making it colder? I think we might be able to test that out. I don't know. That seems a bit weird. I don't know. No, it's not expanding. It's not expanding. It's just more air because we're blowing into it. Oh, think, man. Common fucking sense. Okay. Amazingly, Gorey's machine worked. No longer dependent on ice shipped from 1,000 miles away, Gorey reduced his patients' fevers with homegrown cold. He applied for a patent, correctly predicting a future where artificial cold, as he wrote, might better serve mankind. Fruits, vegetables, and meats will be preserved in transit by my refrigeration system and thereby enjoyed by all. And yet, despite his success as an inventor, Gorey went nowhere as a businessman. Thanks to Tudor's success, natural ice was abundant and cheap when the storms didn't disrupt trade. To make things worse, Tudor himself launched a smear campaign about Gorey's invention, claiming the ice produced by his machine was infected with bacteria. It was a classic case of a dominant industry disparaging a much more powerful new technology, the way the first computers with graphic interfaces were dismissed by their rivals as toys and not serious business machines. John Gorey died penniless, having failed to sell a single machine. But the idea of artificial cold didn't die with Gorey. After thousands of years of neglect, suddenly the globe lit up with patents filed for some variation of artificial refrigeration. The idea was suddenly everywhere, not because people had stolen Gorey's idea, but because they'd independently hit upon the same basic architecture. The conceptual building blocks were finally in place, and so the idea of creating artificially cold air was suddenly in the air. In the air? In the air. Isn't in the air like a bad idiom? Like like how is the plane going? Plan's still in the air. Like it's not grounded. It's not. It's very ambiguous still, right? No, right, right, right. I'm not misremembering anything, am I? I don't know. These patents rippling across the planet are an example of one of the great curiosities in the history of innovation, what scholars now call multiple invention. Inventions and scientific discoveries tend to come in clusters, where a handful of geographically dispersed investigators stumble independently onto the very same discovery. The isolated genius coming up with an idea that no one else could dream of is actually the exception, not the rule. Most discoveries become imaginable at a very specific moment in history, after which point multiple people start to imagine them. The electric battery, the telegraph, the steam engine, and the digital music library were all independently invented by multiple individuals in the space of a few years. In the early 1920s, two Columbia University scholars surveyed the history of invention in a wonderful paper called Are Inventions Inevitable? They found 148 instances of simultaneous invention, most of them occurring within the same decade. Hundreds more have since been discovered. Refrigeration was no different. The knowledge of thermodynamics and the basic chemistry of air, combined with the economic fortunes being made in the ice trade, made artificial cold ripe for invention. One of these simultaneous inventors was the French engineer Ferdinand Carré, who independently designed a refrigeration machine that followed the same basic principles as Gore's. He built prototypes for his refrigeration machine in Paris, but his idea would ultimately triumph He built prototypes for his refrigeration machine in Paris, but his idea would ultimately triumph because of events unfolding across the Atlantic. A different kind of ice famine in the American South. After the Civil War broke out in 1861, the Union blockaded the southern states to cripple the Confederate economy. The Union Navy stopped the flow of ice more effectively than did the storms that churned up along the Gulf Stream. Having built up an economic and cultural dependence on the ice trade, the sweltering southern states suddenly found themselves in desperate need of artificial cold. As the war raged, shipments of smuggled goods could sometimes make it through the blockade at night to land at beaches along the Atlantic and Gulf coasts. But the smugglers weren't just carrying cargoes of gunpowder or weapons. Sometimes they carried goods that were far more novel, ice-making machines based on Carré's design. These new devices used ammonia as a refrigerant and could churn out 400 pounds of ice per hour. Carré's machines were smuggled all the way from France to Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. A network of innovators tinkered with Carré's machines, improving their efficiency. A handful of commercial ice plants opened, marking the debut on the main stage of industrialization. By 1870, the southern states made more artificial ice than anywhere else in the world. In the decades after the Civil War, artificial refrigeration exploded, and the natural ice trade began its slow decline into obsolescence. Refrigeration became a huge industry, measured not just by the cash that changed hands, but also in the sheer size of the machines. Steam-powered monster machines weighing hundreds of tons, maintained by a full-time army of engineers. At the turn of the 20th century, New York's Tribeca neighborhood, now home to some of the most expensive loft apartments in the world, was essentially a giant refrigerator. Entire blocks of windowless buildings designed to chill the endless flood of produce from the nearby Washington Food Market. Can't this fucking thing cool down? I mean, not cool down, quiet down. Almost everything in the 19th century story of cold was all about making it bigger and more ambitious. But the next revolution of artificial cold would proceed in the exact opposite direction. Cold was about to get small. Those block-long Tribeca refrigerators would soon shrink down to fit in every kitchen in America. But the smaller footprint of artificial cold would, ironically, end up triggering changes in human society that were so massive you could see them from space. Man. In the winter of 1916, an eccentric naturalist and entrepreneur moved his young family up to the remote tundra of Labrador. He had spent several winters there on his own, starting a fur company breeding foxes, and occasionally shipping animals and reports back to the U.S. Biological Survey. 5 weeks after the birth of his son, his wife and child joined him. Labrador was, to say the least, not an ideal place for a newborn. The climate was unforgiving, with temperatures regularly hitting 30 degrees below Fahrenheit, and the region was entirely bereft of modern medical facilities. The food, too, left a great deal to be desired. The bleak climate in Labrador meant that everything you ate during the winter was either frozen or preserved. Other than the fish, there was no sources of fresh food. A typical meal would be what locals called brewis, salted cod and hardtack, which is rock-solid bread, boiled up and garnished with scrunchions, which were small fried chunks of salted pork fat. Any meat or produce that had been frozen would be mushy and tasteless when thawed out. But the naturalist was an adventurous eater, fascinated with the cuisines of different cultures. In his journals, he recorded eating everything from rattlesnake to skunk, and so he took up ice fishing with some of the local Inuits, carving holes in frozen lakes and casting a line for trout. With air temperatures so far below zero, a fish pulled out of the lake would freeze solid in a matter of seconds. Unwittingly, the young naturalist had stumbled across a powerful scientific experiment as he sat down to eat with his family in Labrador. When they thawed out the frozen trout from the ice fishing expeditions, they discovered it tasted far fresher than the usual grub. The difference was so striking that he became obsessed with trying to figure out why the frozen trout retained its flavor so much more effectively. And so Clarence Birdseye began an investigation that would ultimately put his name on packages of frozen peas and fish sticks in supermarkets around the world. I should show you this one. I'm not sure about the placement of images in this chapter, because here is the image that was being shown before, but we haven't even gotten to that part yet. The two-door refrigerator home freezer combination. Oh, refrigerator and freezer. I always forget that there are two different things. And here is also Clarence the Birdseye himself. You know, I wish I had a name like Birdseye, dude. I'm stuck with a stupid last name, man. Fucked up and nasty. At first, Birdseye had assumed the trout had been preserved in freshness simply because it had caught more. At first, Birdseye had assumed the trout had preserved its freshness simply because it had been caught more recently, but the more he studied the phenomenon, he began to think there was some other factor at work. For starters, ice fish trout would retain its flavor for months, unlike other frozen fish. He began experimenting with frozen vegetables and discovered that produce frozen in the depths of winter somehow tasted better than produce frozen in late fall or early spring. He analyzed the food under a microscope and noticed a striking difference in the ice crystals that formed during the freezing process. The frozen produce that had lost its flavor had significantly larger crystals that seemed to be breaking down the molecular structure of the food itself. Eventually, Birdseye hit upon a coherent explanation for the dramatic difference in taste. It was all about the speed of the freezing process. A slow freeze allowed the hydrogen bonds of ice to form larger crystalline shapes, but a freeze that happened in seconds, flash freezing as we now call it, generated much smaller crystals that did less damage to the food itself. The Inuit fishermen hadn't thought about it in terms of crystals and molecules, but they had been savoring the benefits of flash freezing for centuries by pulling live fish out of the water into shockingly cold air. As his experiments continued, an idea began to form in Birdseye's mind. With artificial refrigeration becoming increasingly commonplace, the market for frozen food could be immense, assuming you could solve the quality problem. Like Tudor before him, Birdseye began taking notes on his experiments with cold. And like Tudor, the idea would linger in his mind for a decade before it turned into something commercially viable. It was not a sudden epiphany or light bulb moment, but something much more leisurely, an idea taking shape piece by piece over time. It was what I like to call a slow hunch, the anti-light bulb moment, the idea that comes into focus over decades, not seconds. The first inspiration for Birdseye had been the very pinnacle of freshness, a trout pulled out of a frozen lake, but the second would be the exact opposite. A commercial fishing ship's hull filled with rotten cod. After his Labrador adventure, Birdseye returned to his original home in New York and took a job with the Fisheries Association, where he saw firsthand the appalling conditions that characterized the commercial fishing business. The commercial fishing business. The inefficiency and lack of sanitation in the distribution of the whole fresh fish so disgusted me, Birdseye would later write, and I set out to develop a method that would permit the removal of inedible waste from perishable foods at production points, packaging them in compact and convenient containers and distributing them to the housewife with their intrinsic freshness intact. Compact and convenient containers. Perishable foods at production points, packaging them in compact and convenient containers. This guy loves alliteration, dude. I hate my life, dude. In the first decades of the 20th century, the frozen food business was considered to be the very bottom of the barrel. Isn't it the same nowadays? I don't know. You could buy frozen fish or produce, but it was widely assumed to be inedible. In fact, frozen food was so appalling that it was banned at New York State prisons for being below the culinary standards of the convicts. One key problem was that the food was being frozen at relatively high temperatures, often just a few degrees below freezing. Yet scientific advances over the previous decades had made it possible to artificially produce temperatures that were positively Labradorian. By the early 1920s, Birdseye had developed a flash freezing process using stacked cartons of fish, frozen at minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Inspired by the new industrial model of Henry Ford's Model T factory, he created a double belt freezer that ran the freezing process along a much more efficient production line. He formed a company called General Seafood using these new production techniques. Birdseye found that just about anything he froze with this method, fruit, meat, vegetables, would be remarkably fresh after thawing. Here's the man, the myth, the legend, Birdseye, Clarence Birdseye, testing out how to freeze foods, man. Interesting. Let me compare. Look at that. In 1912, they don't date this photo, but he's much older. He's got like he's experimenting in a suit and a tie. My God. I mean, he's working with cold. I guess it would be reasonable to put on like 2 or 3 layers. Oh, I should also show this picture. This guy's not Clarence Birdseye. He's just a worker. You know. Notice that it's not bird's eye, it's bird's eye. It's 2 different words, 2 distinct words. Perishable rush. Oh, interesting. Oh, it's also interesting that this track does a U-turn right here, dude. I wonder why it does that. Isn't that weird? Why does it just go? I guess because it's a ramp and you can't really like sharp turn along the ramp. You gotta go the long way, right? I think that's why. Frozen food was still more than a decade away from being a staple of the American diet. It required a critical mass of freezers in supermarkets and home kitchens that wouldn't fully come into being until the post-war years. But Bird's Eye experiments were so promising that in 1929, just months before the Black Friday crash, General Seafood was acquired by the Postum Cereal Company, which promptly changed its name to General Foods. General Foods. It's always General this, General that. Bird's Eye's adventures in ice fishing had made him a multi-millionaire. His name endures on packages of frozen fish fillets to this day. Bird's Eye's frozen food breakthrough took shape as a small hunch, but it also emerged as a kind of collision between several very different geographic and intellectual spaces. To imagine a world of flash frozen food, Bird's Eye needed to experience the challenges of feeding a family in an Arctic climate surrounded by brutal cold. He needed to spend time with the Inuit fishermen. He needed to inspect the foul containers of cod fishing trawlers in New York harbors. He needed the scientific knowledge of how to produce temperatures well below freezing, and he needed the industrial knowledge of how to build a production line. Oh my god. That's like so fucking dramatic. I gotta show you guys this. It's not even related to the story at all, but I just looked at my leg and there's this huge mother-loving scab right here. It's like a jump scare, dude. What the hell? It's absolutely massive. It's rock hard, dude. I don't know when I was bleeding, but apparently I was bleeding like hell. Oh, I accidentally peeled away the scab. Whoopsies. Like every big idea, Bird's Eye's breakthrough was not a single insight, but a network of other ideas packaged together in a new configuration. What made Bird's Eye's idea so powerful was not simply his individual genius, but the diversity of places and forms of expertise that he brought together. Interesting. So in the previous chapter, it was all about glass kind of fanning out into all these different like areas, right? Like glass, it was first cloudy, but then they added this to it and it became clear. They put this in this shape and like put it together into glasses, and they like put them in this different configuration. They made telescopes and microscopes, and then they also and then they also like stretched it very thin and they made fibers. It's all about like doing this and that to glass to make it like different, right? It's about fanning into different areas, but here it's about experience of a person being all brought together and married to make fucking awesomely fresh preserved food. In our age of locally sourced artisanal food production, the frozen TV dinners that arose in the decades after Bird's Eye's discovery have fallen out of favor. But in its original incarnation, frozen food had a positive impact on health, introducing more nutrition in the diets of Americans. Flash frozen food extended the reach of the food network in both time and space. Produce harvested in summer could be consumed months later. Fish caught in the North Atlantic could be eaten in Denver or Dallas. It was better to eat frozen peas in January than it was to wait 5 months for fresh ones. Oh boy, now we're coming to the AC era. By the 1950s, America had adopted a lifestyle that was profoundly shaped by artificial cold, buying frozen dinners purchased in the refrigerated aisles of the local supermarket and stacking them up in the deep freezes of their new Frigidaires, featuring the latest in ice-making technology. Behind the scenes, the entire economy of cold was supported by a vast fleet of refrigerated trucks transporting bird's-eye frozen peas and their many imitations around the country. In that iconic 1950s American household, the most novel cold-producing device was not storing fish fillets for dinner or making ice for the martinis. It was cooling down and dehumidifying the entire house. The first apparatus for treating air had been dreamed up by a young engineer named Willis Carrier in 1902. The story of Carrier's invention is a classic in the annals of accidental discovery. As a 25-year-old engineer, Carrier had been hired by a printing company in Brooklyn to devise a scheme that would help them keep the ink from smearing in the humid summer months. Carrier's invention not only removed the humidity from the printing room, it also chilled the air. Carrier noticed that everyone suddenly wanted to have lunch next to the printing presses, and he began to design contraptions that would be deliberately built to regulate the humidity and temperature in an interior space. Within a few years, Carrier had formed a company, still one of the largest air conditioning manufacturers in the country. Within a few years, Carrier had formed a company, still one of the largest AC manufacturers in the world, that focused on industrial uses for the technology. But Carrier was convinced that air conditioning should also belong to the masses. His first great test came over Memorial Day weekend in 1925, when Carrier debuted an experimental AC system in Paramount Pictures' new flagship Manhattan movie theater, the Rivoli. Theaters had long been oppressive places to visit during the summer months. In fact, a number of Manhattan playhouses had experimented with ice-based cooling during the 19th century, with predictably moist results. Before AC, the whole idea of a summer blockbuster would have seemed preposterous. The last place you want to be on a warm day was a room filled with 1,000 other perspiring bodies. And so Carrier had persuaded Adolph Zukor, the legendary chief of Paramount, that there was money to be made by investing in central air for his theaters. Zukor himself showed up for the Memorial Day weekend test, sitting inconspicuously in the balcony seats. Carrier and his team had some technical difficulties getting the AC up and running. The room was filled with hand fans waving furiously before the picture started. Carrier later recalled the scene in his memoirs. It takes time to pull down the temperature in a quickly filled theater on a hot day, and a still longer time for a packed house. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the fans dropped into lapse as the effects of the air conditioning system became evident. Only a few chronic fanners persisted, but soon they too ceased fanning. We then went into the lobby and waited for Mr. Zukor to come downstairs. When he saw us, he did not wait for us to ask his opinion. He said tersely, "Yes, the people are going to like it." I'm going to show you some pictures here. Here's an AC test. It's smoke making cool air visible. Interesting how it doesn't go up to the ceiling. You think like air conditioning would like pull down the whole space, right? But it's only the lower levels. If I was to like put a ladder into this room and go up this ceiling, I think I would start sweating over there. Maybe. I'm not sure. Here's also this one. Sackett and Williams Printing Company air conditioning system. I'm not sure what the air conditioning system is here. Is this a hand operated thing? I'm not sure. I guess these are workers tending to the AC system. Man, imagine having an AC system so sophisticated that you need workers. You need to hire workers just to operate it. That's weird. Between 1925 and 1950, Most Americans experienced air conditioning only in large commercial spaces such as movie theaters, department stores, hotels, or office buildings. Carrier knew that AC was headed for the domestic sphere, but the machines were simply too large and expensive for a middle-class home. The Carrier Corporation did offer a glimpse of this feature in its 1939 World's Fairest attraction, the Igloo of Tomorrow. In a bizarre structure that looked something like a 5-story helping of soft-serve vanilla ice cream, Carrier showcased the wonders of domestic air conditioning, accompanied by a squadron of rocket-style snow bunnies. Of course, it's that time of America where you need to hire models with very little clothing to help advertise any sort of technology, dude. What the fuck? That was a weird time in America. But Carrier's vision of domestic cool would be postponed by the outbreak of World War II. It wasn't until the late 1940s, after almost 50 years of experimentation, that air conditioning finally made its way to the home front, with the first in-window portable units appearing on the market. Within half a decade, Americans were installing more than 1 million units a year. When we think about 20th century miniaturization, our minds naturally gravitate to the transistor or the microchip, but the shrinking footprint of air conditioning deserves its place in the annals of innovation as well. A machine that had once been larger than a flatbed truck, reduced in size that it could fit in a window. The shrinking would quickly set off an extraordinary chain of events, in many ways rivaling the impact of the automobile on settlement patterns in the United States. Places that had been intolerably hot and humid, including some of the places where Frederick Tudor had sweated out the summer as a young man, were suddenly tolerable to a much larger slice of the general public. By 1964, the historic flow of people from south to north that had characterized the post-Civil War era had been reversed. What? All it takes is AC to make that happen? My God. Because, the South was economically devastated by the Civil War. That was why people were going to the North, right? And then all it takes is fucking AC to bring people back to the South? That's... some part of my mind takes that as highly improbable. I don't know why. The Sun Belt expanded with new immigrants from colder states who could put up with the tropical humidity or blazing desert climates thanks to domestic air conditioning. Tucson rocketed from 45,000 people to 210,000 people in just 10 years. Houston expanded from 600,000 to 940,000 in the same decade. In the 1920s, when Willis Carrier was first demonstrating air conditioning to Adolph Zukor in the Rivoli Theater, Florida's population stood at less than 1 million. Half a century later, the state was well on the way to becoming one of the foremost populous in the country. With 10 million people escaping the humid summer months in air-conditioned homes, Carrier's invention circulated more than just molecules of oxygen and water. It ended up circulating people as well. That is true. I like that. I love that comparison. Broad changes in demography invariably have political effects. The migration to the Sun Belt changed the political map of America. Once a democratic stronghold, the South was besieged by a massive influx of retirees who were much more conservative in their political outlook. As the historian Nelson W. Polsby demonstrates in his book, How Congress Evolves, Northern Republicans moving south in the post-AC era did as much to undo the Dixiecrat base as the rebellion against the let's redo that sentence. As the historian Nelson W. Polsby demonstrates in his book How Congress Evolves, Northern Republicans moving south in the post-AC era did as much to undo the Dixiecrat base as the rebellion against the civil rights movement did. Did as much to undo the Dixiecrat base as the rebellion against the civil rights movement. So the Dixiecrat base was the rebellion against the civil rights movement, and the Republicans helped to dismantle the Dixiecrat base and thus dismantle the rebellion. In Congress, this had the paradoxical effect of unleashing a wave of liberal reforms, as the congressional Democrats were no longer divided between conservative Southerners and progressives in the North. But air conditioning arguably had the most significant impact on presidential politics. Swelling populations in Florida, Texas, and Southern California shifted the Electoral College towards the Sun Belt, with warm climate states gaining 29 Electoral College votes between 1940 and 1980, while the colder states of the Northeast and Rust Belt lost 31. In the first half of the 20th century, only 2 presidents or vice presidents hailed from Sun Belt states. Starting in 1952, however, every single winning presidential ticket contained a Sun Belt candidate, until Barack Obama and Joe Biden broke the streak in 2008. This is long zoom history. About a century after Willis Carrier began thinking about keeping the ink from smearing in Brooklyn, our ability to manipulate tiny molecules of air and moisture helped transform the geography of American politics. But the rise of the Sun Belt in the United States was just a dress rehearsal for what is now happening on a planetary scale. All around the world, the fastest growing megacities are predominantly in tropical climates. Chennai, Bangkok, Manila, Jakarta, Karachi, Lagos, Dubai, Rio de Janeiro. Demographers predict that these hot cities will have more than 1 billion new residents by 2025. New residents, what is that? I don't know. What else? It goes without saying that many of these new immigrants don't have air conditioning in their homes, at least not yet, and it is an open question whether these cities are sustainable in the long run, particularly those based in desert climates. But the ability to control temperature and humidity in office buildings, stores, and wealthier homes allow these urban centers to attract an economic base that has catapulted them to megacity status. It's no accident that the world's largest cities, London, Paris, New York, and Tokyo, were almost exclusively in temperate climates until the second half of the 20th century. What we are seeing now is arguably the largest mass migration in human history, and the first to be triggered by a home appliance. Oh my god, my jaw just cracked, and ow, that fucking hurt. The dreamers and inventors who ushered in the Cold Revolution didn't have eureka moments, and their brilliant ideas rarely transformed the world immediately. Mostly they had hunches, but they were tenacious enough to keep these hunches alive for years, even decades, until the pieces came together. Some of these innovations can seem trivial to us today. All that collective ingenuity, focused over decades and decades, all to make the world safe for the TV dinner. But the frozen world that Tudor and Birdseye helped conjure into the world would do more than just populate the world with fish sticks. It would also populate the world with people, thanks to the flash freezing and crowd preservation of human semen, eggs, and embryos. What the fuck? Millions of human beings around the world owe their existence to the technologies of the technologies of artificial cold. Really? That many people were born through artificial insemination? Really? Interesting. Of course, it's not just artificial insemination. There's cryopreservation of eggs and embryos. So, of course, more than just insemination must be happening. I'm not sure. Millions of human beings. Really? I'm not sure. Today, new technologies in oocyte cryopreservation are allowing women to store healthy eggs in their younger years, extending their fertility well into their 40s and 50s in many cases. Really? So much of the new freedom in the way we have children now, from lesbian couples or single mothers using sperm banks to conceive, to women giving themselves 2 decades in the workforce before thinking about kids, would have been impossible without the invention of flash freezing. When we think about breakthrough ideas, we tend to be constrained by the scale of the I'm killing myself. When we think about breakthrough ideas, we tend to be constrained by the scale of the original invention. We figure out a way to make artificial cold, and we assume that will just mean our rooms will be cold, or we'll sleep better on hot nights, or there will be a reliable supply of ice cubes for our sodas. That much is easy to understand. But if you tell the story of cold only in that way, you miss the epic scope of it. Just 2 centuries after Frederick Tudor started thinking about shipping ice to Savannah, our mastery of cold is helping to reorganize settlement patterns all around the planet and bring millions of new babies into the world. Ice seems at first glance like a trivial advance, a luxury item, not a necessity. Yet over the past 2 centuries, its impact has been staggering when you look at it from the long zoom perspective. From the transformed landscape of the Great Plains, to the new lives and lifestyles brought into being via frozen embryos, all the way to vast cities blooming in the desert. Finally, I'm done. I'm fucking done, man. Oh right, I need to show you, I skipped over 2 illustrations, not illustrations, pictures. Here's our first one. A theater, the Irving Theater, in the 1920s, that advertises the fact that it was cooled by refrigeration by the Carrier Engineering Corporation. Isn't that cool? Also, oh my goodness. Look at the architecture, man. Look at this curve over here. Oh my god. And of course, this bright lights of the 1920s, roaring 20s. But still, you got Greco-Roman, what is this, pediment? You got, some columns here. Oh, of course, this, I forget what it's called, and this giant pediment here. Oh my goodness. It's like a merging of the old and new. And, of course, it's kind of segmented. It's kind of segmented tripartite style into 3 segments. And each of them have, a shape of, a brownstone or something. But it's all joined together to form a single movie theater. Isn't that awesome, dude? My god. And here's the second picture. Here's the very horny Willis Carrier, surrounded by all these girls that are posing as snow bunnies. And he's holding a tiny thermometer. At the St. Louis World's Fair. Oh, that's why there's an arch, right? The giant arch here. Because in St. Louis, I believe, or maybe it's Detroit or somewhere, but they got this giant fucking arch that is honestly kind of overblown and overhyped. But I guess that's why they have the arch. Or maybe it's where the AC is coming from. I don't know. But honestly though, they're standing in what is fucking snow, right? Or maybe artificial snow somewhere, but it looks fucking cold. And those women are all in fucking sandals, which is fucking, oh my god, I can't imagine being in that room. I would be booking it out of there once it's done. But that is the second chapter. And I've bent the spine of the books in irreparable fashion. Oh my god. And my throat is fucking hurting. It's more than dry, it's just hurting. I'm going to get myself some water. I'm gonna get a snack and I'm gonna actually do some work. Fucking, my god.